On this episode of the Scale of Good podcast, we welcome Vikum Rajapakse, the co-founder and director of Kantala Brands, on behalf of the Roots We Take project, a project where we're mapping out Sri Lanka's creative, sustainable industries across the island to talk about the history of Sri Lanka's sustainable creative industries and how we can preserve and celebrate them into the future. So have a listen on all of our platforms, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say about the future. Welcome to the Scale the Good podcast. Today we have Vikum Rajapakse, who is the co-founder of Kantala Brands. And we're here to have a discussion about what we see currently on the landscape of Sri Lanka's sustainable creative sector, and also the potential where it has to grow into. And this is all part of the Roots We Take project that we're doing, which is mapping out individuals and organizations whose work focuses on creativity and sustainability. So I think to start, for people to have an understanding, if you could tell a little bit about yourself and the Kantala brand.
Super. Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me on this podcast. So I am a co-founder and director at Kantala. And so we are a social enterprise which is making vegan and sustainable materials and products for the fashion and lifestyle sector. So one of our core brands is also Kantala, which is a vegan fashion accessories brand. And our founding was inspired in the traditional craft sector of Sri Lanka. The specific craft is what is called the Dumbara Hana craft. It started off about in end of 2012 was when we kind of came up with the idea of it, met the artisans, and so a lot of creative potential that's being untapped, and also a creative sector which also, if leveraged correctly, with the right principles, the right value systems, and obviously with the right value proposition to the market, stands to really help the country's economy.
Yes, definitely.
Especially considering that most of the craft sector is based in the rural parts of the country. So you have the potential of using these creative knowledge, indigenous principles, values, and really kind of repackaging them into products and services which the contemporary consumer requires,
Yes.
needs, and more or less also the environment needs, the community at large needs. So it was kind of all of these coming together, and rather than just feeling sad for the fact that we are not utilizing these traditional crafts, this indigenous knowledge, or it being lost, we thought, we can actually turn this into something positive, something of economic value. So that's how kind of like the inspiration for Kantala came about. But as we went along, so we started off just doing the vegan fashion accessories, the vegan regenerative fashion accessories. But later on, as we kind of started to understand more about the craft, the raw materials that are being used, the properties of those, we saw even much larger potential. Even these centuries-old crafts were not utilizing.
Yeah.
And that's then where we started R&Ding, using the same plant material, things like vegan leather. And hopefully by maybe end of this year, from the same plant, we'll hopefully have some surfboards made as well. So who knows? But all of these are centered around being creative.
Yeah.
We work with other creatives, people with inspirational ideas, concepts, and that's what Kantala is today. So we kind of see ourselves more greater, bigger than just being the fashion accessories brand.
Yep.
More now it's oriented towards finding very regenerative, vegan, carbon negative solutions for the fashion and lifestyle sector.
Fantastic. And I think that there's a general theme of innovation across all of the products and work that you do. But in terms of materials that you use, I think you mentioned one being kind of vegan leather, plant-based leather, which is a little bit more new and modern. But one that you touch on is the Hana fiber, and that being a little bit more indigenous. Can you talk about what the impact of using indigenous materials in the country is, and maybe some other examples that you've seen throughout the country? Because it feels like we're moving away from that. And of course, looking at alternatives like vegan and plant-based leather is fantastic. But what are some things that we may be losing out on if we don't look back into our history?
So I think when you look back, so most of the traditional crafts were those weren't the main occupation back in the day.
Okay.
So a lot of the traditional crafts were things a lot of these communities did after their primary occupation, which was more often than not being farmers.
Right.
They were either farming to sell their excess, or they were just purely subsistence farmers. So Sri Lanka's craft sector, therefore, back those days, they got used to sourcing material, which they don't also have to put a lot of effort into growing and maintaining.
Right.
Because this was not their primary occupation.
Sure.
So they had if you look at a lot of the traditional crafts, be it cane, be it this Tumbara Hana craft,
Yeah.
or even things based on reed, grass type materials.
Yeah.
All of these are regrowing plants. So lots of these traditional crafts. Now I can't speak for things like lacquer based or brass. That's not my area of expertise or knowledge. A lot of these other crafts were a lot of the weaving based crafts were based on materials which are regenerative. They regrow as long as you harvest them responsibly, sustainably. So now we had no knowledge of this aspect when we started working, but as we started working with these indigenous communities, we started seeing those choices that they have made centuries back, which render these in the contemporary situation to be very sustainable ways of practicing an industry. So obviously, as we started working with them, when we kind of made the first connection with the Tumbara Hana village, it was a dying craft.
Yeah.
So it had to be modernized in certain ways.
Of course.
The process of weaving, extracting the fiber, dyeing it, weaving it, finishing, were all still the same 300-year-old, 400-year-old methods, techniques they were using. So obviously the next generation is quite reluctant.
Of course.
Part of it is that it doesn't give a reasonable economic income and economic return, but also the fact that they want to be working at a desk, to be seen in a more professional environment.
Right.
So obviously there are certain innovations, new things that we have to do, and also scale certain things to a more commercially oriented model.
Yep.
So this is where, for example, whereas the artisans used to just harvest hana leaves from freely growing plants, we've now started working with the craft community to expand the hana, like growing it more commercially, more in more an agricultural sense.
Great.
So working with farming communities,
Nice.
outgrower programs, buyback schemes, working with the plantation sector, and also even looking at our own plantations to set up very biodiverse, multi-crop kind of systems.
Sure.
So there are obviously times when we, in certain aspects, where we still remain ingrained in those indigenous principles. So, for example, continuing to use the same material source. I.e., if we thought like, okay, the fiber supply is not enough, we could have moved into a different fiber. You could have obviously gone synthetics.
Yes.
But, why would we?
Yeah.
It just kills the whole purpose. But yeah, so that's where we then look at scaling.
Yeah.
Another example I would say is the craft community. Traditionally, historically only used the fiber extracted from the leaf. But the fiber only amounts to about 5% of the leaf weight.
Okay.
The balance, about 35% is the succulent, a dry succulent mass, and the rest is liquid,
Okay.
moisture.
Okay.
Now, that entire, they were using only 5%, the entire balance was going to waste. So that's where then we again look at our collaborative networks, and we look at how can we infuse some R&D into this and do something with the other components of it.
Fantastic.
So that's where the whole vegan leather material comes in. So we leave the fiber aside, obviously for the weaving, but use the succulent now into a different hopefully commercially viable, because it's now the prototyping stage, to a more commercial scale. And then you have the stem which grows. So this is a perennial plant. It keeps on regrowing. It's a monocarpic, so it flowers and then it dies.
Yeah.
So there, it was again a part of the plant which is going to waste. And then we met this, I think I'll call him some Sri Lankan, but he has, what do you say? He has roots elsewhere in the world as well. So he just got in touch with us and was like, like back in the day in Hawaii when they started surfing, they made surfboards out of the agave stem.
Right.
So the plant we use is not agave, but it's very similar in certain properties to it. And we were like, let's give it a shot.
Yeah.
So initial trials seemed to be fine.
Great.
So, and I think the next one we want to do is just look at how can we make something out of the moisture content.
Awesome.
So still and I think that's how we also changed over time, because like I said, we started just making handbags.
Sure.
But as we kind of became more educated, more knowledgeable about the material source, why it was chosen, the other properties of it, and all of these other different avenues open. But again, it's also thanks to the craft community themselves, because they've been very open in terms of not withholding any knowledge.
Sure.
They've obviously there was a sense of trust between them and us.
Which is not always the case sometimes.
Yeah. Which took good 2-3 years to build.
Yeah, okay.
So, it's fair.
Yeah, exactly.
Why should they just straight away open up to a bunch of strangers? So, yeah, they've been very, very kind, thoughtful, generous in terms of sharing their knowledge. And that's obviously coming from a very creative perspective they have.
Yeah.
And then the indigenous creative kind of community is very considerate in terms of how what they do impacts everything else.
Yeah, and it seems like you've really now kind of nailed down the intersection of how we can blend innovation and kind of some of these modern tools that we have and have access to what we have in Plentiful and within your business model. And I think anyway, something that we always want to see is how every part of whatever ingredient or a material that we're using can be utilized throughout the supply chain. So it's great to hear that.
Thank you.
And I've through all of the entries that we've had come in for the map, I've seen that across the board, and even things that reflect those regions' resources, which I think is most important.
Yes, yeah.
Because like you said, those communities know best, and they've had years and years of practice with it. And I think it's nice to see the synergies and collaborations of how we can take it to the next level. But yeah, I think it's nice to kind of see that almost on like a micro level of what's happening. But I'd like to take a step back and see things a bit from a macro level. You were part of the 2020 British Council Creative Industries Report, which was kind of a founding document for the work that we're doing, and that Good Life X has done previously. I think that there's so many good findings and information that has been collated there, that some of the actions we're seeing now 4 years out. But can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the findings that you found, or some of the insights you have, and what you are currently seeing from the sustainable creative industry sector?
So taking a step back, when you like the British Council report,
Yeah.
the IPS research work that they did together, it was, I think that was the very first time something like that was attempted here.
Yes.
So there was a lot of gray areas.
Yeah.
There were also in terms of a definition. Do we use a global level definition? Do we contextualize it to Sri
Right.
Lanka? So I think for it being a very first kind of look, research at the creative sector in Sri Lanka, I think it's a good starting point. And in terms of the findings we saw there, I think there is a very there's a lot of interest and already participation in the different creative sectors. And so that was also part of the, let's say, for example, part of the challenge, because you need to have a very solid definition if you're going to be looking at across sectors.
Sure.
So what level of input is it? What level of value creation is it? Design creation, so kind of considering all of those together. And funny enough, I think what we also saw is there are lots of creatives, but articulating how that translates into value was one of the, I think, one key finding.
Okay.
Or let's say it was a challenge, because when you go and do the the focus group discussions or the interviews, you obviously, what the researchers used to say was there's obviously a lot of creative knowledge, they know what they're doing, they have valid creative input, but maybe for the lack of a market, they don't know what's the kind of value that their creative work generates.
Sure. And you're not just speaking economic value, or?
This in terms of economic value.
Okay.
Yeah. Then the other part was that a lot of these creatives were generally more oriented towards a very sustainable, responsible way of doing their work.
Right.
Very, very conscious of the impact of their work on their community, on the environment, which wasn't a focus of the report.
Yeah.
It was purely to map the creative industry. But what we saw was there was this across the board, be in many sectors. It could be fashion and lifestyle. It could be design, print work. It could be arts and crafts, and a few others. There was a substantial emphasis, or these creatives displayed awareness.
Sure.
And this was across different age groups as well, and across different parts of the country. So which I think was the more important finding of it is that Sri Lanka's creative sector has, let's say, a very kind of natural inclination, or has a grounding on being connected with sustainable values, and being very conscious or aware.
To nature and...
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, natural surroundings.
So the report, by any means, I won't say it was a comprehensive report.
Sure.
I mean, if you read it, it says so as well.
Yes.
But I think the findings were very encouraging for a first report. And I think, for example, the Roots We Take project that GLX, you are launching. I think one of that gap in terms of creating, connecting the creatives with a market,
Yeah.
with economic value. I think that is what's, to a greater degree, Roots We Take is trying to promote by promoting the creatives, their work, exposing them, getting them on platforms and spaces where they can present, speak, educate others about their creative work. But also the fact that this is also very centered around the regenerative principles, the sustainable principles, which again kind of, I think, is great to reinforce what the creative sector is already doing.
Yes, definitely. No, it's great to hear kind of the context of how that experience was. I think we've worked with a few people who were a part of that report, but like you said, and the report says, it was not completely comprehensive.
Yeah.
But it's great to hear that a majority of the creatives that you came across and found were in some ways aligned to sustainability in nature. But yeah, when you do take a look at that specific focus and niche, what are some of the things that you see in the current landscape, and perhaps maybe some potential that we have to grow into, that maybe you have come across abroad, or just some innovative ideas?
I mean, I think the creative sector isn't, I don't know, maybe the creative sector as at large, as a whole sector, I don't think is seen as an economic contributor. I mean, maybe now certain policy conversations may be happening. For example, let's take the traditional craft sector. The government historically has seen the traditional craft sector as its efforts are to preserve the craft, not to look at the craft's indigenous knowledge as an economic asset,
Right.
or an asset that can create economic, social, environment impact.
Yeah.
It's purely seen as preserving part of the cultural identity.
Yeah.
So obviously you see, like, something that always, these conversations that happen in terms of policy making is, oh, you know what, like, make some products, sell it to the tourists.
Right.
Because it's seen as a cultural product only. So just to put as much cultural emphasis on it as much as possible, and then just like sell it to a tourist within the country.
Right. Which is so limiting into what its capacity can be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So craftspeople, designers, artisans, not designers, artisans and craftspeople have been trained to think that way. How to put in as much cultural emphasis into the design as possible,
Okay.
or cultural identity
Right.
into the design as much as possible, so that it's seen as a souvenir a tourist buys, more than actually a product that they see as being complementary to what they wear every day or what they use in their house every day. To look at it as something like that,
Right.
which, like you said, it limits
Yeah.
the potential. So there have been policies which, because of it's coming from the wrong perspective, approach, ends up materializing into policies which kind of suffocate, restrict, constrain certain creative sectors rather than enabling them to flourish.
Okay.
So that's kind of one area which I feel needs addressing
Okay.
to kind of really let it flourish. Again, entertainment-wise, Sri Lanka is an amazing destination for the film industry, be it I don't know, television, whatnot. There's lots of talent in terms of directing, back, like, what do you call it, behind the scenes production work.
Yep.
So again, kind of unleashing that potential. I mean, one area that hardly ever gets looked at is Sri Lanka's theatre.
Okay. Yeah.
Theatre sector. We have, be it in Colombo or in the urban centres, you have like great productions happening. But traditionally, if you go outside of the outside of the urban centers into rural areas, there's lots of theater-based performance arts.
Yeah.
Theater, dance, music, performances. Take for example, puppeteering.
Yes. Yeah.
One of Sri Lanka has 2 UNESCO World Heritage cultural IPs. The first one of that was puppeteering.
Really? Wow.
Which, because it's very unique, the Sri
Yes.
Lankan puppeteering style, storytelling, it's very unique. I mean, recently this one farming community that works with us, they have this centuries old, what do you call it, like a, in Sinhala you call it an ambalama. In English it's like a rest spot.
A pagoda?
Kind of. Yeah. For like travelers, weary travelers to spend time, kind of recuperate.
Right.
So, long time ago, this village apparently in the evenings had like these, in Sinhala they call it kavisatan. It's like a, like, I don't know, like a poem, like poetry, kind of, you know, battle, something like that happens in the village. And there are lots of these historical stories and performances surrounding those. Again, in terms of tourism value, both local and foreign, these theater, these performing arts have lots of stories to tell. It's just we need to look. Therefore, I think, because why we don't get that is because we don't see the creative economy or the creative industry as a potential contributor to economic growth, economic liberation. And I mean, again, you don't have to do a lot, because a lot of these are based in rural areas. So you give them the spaces, the platforms, the access to do it, and I think they'll be very good at kind of generating the income they need.
Absolutely.
To help stop things like internal migration, where a lot of youth are leaving these communities. But that's the thing. I think we need policy dialogue, a national vision, or part of the national vision which is centered around the creative industry. I think until we come to that position, I think a lot of these policies, interventions are going to be ad hoc, going to be isolated, and in certain cases might actually have a negative effect.
Because I think we also undervalue the other ripple effects that these practices have. For example, bringing community together, having kind of like essentially like a safe space for people to be creative, express, find people, like-minded people within their communities, which sometimes maybe in urban areas you would think happens a bit more frequently. But that's not to say if we take away these things or undervalue that it can't happen out in other areas as well.
Absolutely, yes.
So it's looking at it in those kind of ways. So I think you touched a little bit upon how your community and some of the people that you work with have responded, how the country and government has responded. What do you think the private sector's role, or how they are seeing the creative industries at this point?
So I guess maybe in the last 8-10 years, there's been a kind of growing interest, especially in the micro, small sectors. Enterprises entering into these creative spaces, especially if you think about the craft sector. You have lots of emerging fashion brands, accessory brands, homeware brands, which are really starting to leverage those indigenous crafts. Now, how some of them leverage the principles and the values behind those might change. To what degree? Some people might, some enterprises might just do it because it's aesthetically very pleasing, or those kind of crafts cater to a certain clientele who's looking for a certain aesthetic. But there are some who are very much doing it because they see those indigenous values, principles being fundamental to addressing climate impacts, social issues, environment challenges, all of those. But there is a growing interest. Now, are these the large private sector, the mediums, the large enterprises who have the capital, the deep pockets, the access to finance to really scale these things up? No.
Sure.
Because the traditional craft sector is not a large-scale sector.
Right.
It's human-based, it's personal creative-based, so it obviously has its scale limitations in terms of scale.
Sure.
So yes, it's very adept at the small, micro-small, and maybe some of the medium enterprises to do it. There is interest, and I think taking these creative sectors, one, to realize its economic potential, two, to scale its impact, you need private sector involvement.
Yeah.
The government can't do it, and for many reasons, and the government should not do it.
Yeah.
The private sector, something that I say all the time is, we didn't create anything new at Kantala.
Yeah.
Maybe the vegan leather and those things are something different,
Sure.
but in terms of the fashion accessories brand, Kantala, we just connected dots.
Yeah.
That's all that we did. We saw an amazing craft. We saw an amazing story heard an amazing story behind it, understood the indigenous values, principles of it, then saw that there's a market potential, there's a requirement.
Yeah.
There are certain consumers who want it. There are certain consumers who don't know they want it. And there is a social environment challenge that also needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
And I mean, the whole myth is like, oh, we need to keep on producing, because if not, how are we going to pull people out of poverty? So that's one of the fundamental things. I mean, that's one of like I don't know what to say, it's like kind of the capitalist machine preaches to everyone.
Yeah.
The problem is a matter of distribution.
Yes.
There's enough resources, opportunities, value chains, for as long as the value is redistributed equitably.
Yeah.
So again, these traditional craft sectors, they're very community based.
Yeah.
So there in itself, those bringing them into setups like cooperatives, village associations, then connecting them to private sector value chains, again creates a transparency, enables the redistribution of wealth in a more equitable way.
Yeah.
So there are lots of these things the private sector can do. And like I said before, modernizing these crafts, you retain its indigenous cultural traditional essence.
Yeah.
But you also need to introduce an environment which is professional, which is inspiring, and which gives dignity to the people that work there. If you don't do that, you are not going to get a young generation working there.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't. I think it's very unfair to tell anyone that they are not engaging in a particular industry just because maybe they were born into those rural areas or those kind of practicing communities, and because I mean everyone wants a dignified life.
Right.
So if a particular industry, for all of its aesthetic, cultural, traditional values, cannot give the people who work in it a dignified livelihood, no one needs to come and work there.
No.
So again, that's where I think another role the private sector can play here.
Yeah. It's also looking at giving, yes, economic value, but also value and dignity of that work, that specialty, that craft.
Yeah.
reversing how we view these industries.
Absolutely.
The
And I mean,
mindset.
yeah, I mean, if you think about the garment industry, so back late 80s, early 90s, when the garment industry started, it started moving to the rural areas, women having to work long shifts, late shifts. There was a lot of cultural resistance saying, oh, don't go out, it's not ideal for a lady, a girl, a woman to be working late. But the most successful garment companies, apparel companies, they revamped the factories. They look
Yes.
very modern, lots of lighting, open spaces, provided transportation, did all this. But people were like, when they come to see the workplace, they're like, wow, this is not what I thought it was.
Yes.
It's more modern, it's professional, it's dignified.
Right.
Obviously, the garment industry has its concerns around wages and whatnot to be addressed.
Yeah.
But at least in terms of, at least the more large garments which are based in the zones, at least, have that environment where at least the physical environment kind of gives a professional setting. Obviously, then you need to go beyond that. You need to ensure it's not just physically looks great, but it's psychologically, emotionally also fulfilling and dignified for the people who work there.
Of course.
But the creative especially the craft sector can't do that by themselves.
No.
The government definitely is not capacitated to do it.
Right.
The private sector, and especially these micro, small, medium enterprises, entrepreneurs, I think have a significant role to play there.
Yes.
What the government need to do is to create the enabling environment for those entrepreneurs and enterprises to kind of see, to take those values, those systems, principles of those traditional crafts and translate it into products and services of economic value.
Yes.
And the government obviously has a role to play in terms of ensuring it's a very democratic system, that it's equitable distribution of wealth, redistribution of the value, things like those. I think, my personal belief is Sri Lanka doesn't have to do crazy things to get out of this economic crisis, the social crisis that we are in. We have plenty of IP in our rural areas. Yes, it can be in farming, it can be in related to nutrition, it can be related to health, it can be just things like crafts that need to be mainstreamed in a way that it generates confidence, trust, and appeal with the market.
Yes.
Example, when we started doing with the traditional crafts, when we say craft, a lot of people like, that's not very well made.
Craft or handicraft as
exactly.
well.
It's like, we always get asked the question, why are we so expensive? It's handicraft. It's Sri Lankan handicraft. It should be cheap. And so we asked them, why? You use it a month, then it just tears apart. Or, well, it's just good as a one use.
Sure.
So obviously we need to take time to dispel those.
Yes.
Obviously there are bad practices in the value chains, in the supply chains that kind of have contributed to creating those impressions. But if we bring the private sector in, the government can give the right enabling environment. There's plenty of plenty of IP out there that we can modernize, repackage, represent to the world, and there are people waiting to pay ridiculous amounts of money for what's just out there. It's just really realizing who's ready to pay how much does it take to make, then connecting the dots with design, quality, functionality, and the right kind of communication. I think there's lots that can be done.
Wonderful. As an entrepreneur who has taken this journey, do you have any kind of final thoughts or words of inspiration, encouragement for anyone else who is currently in the industry or wants to get involved?
I mean, I just say is, I mean, we need to just be humble to learn.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing.
Great.
I think we grew so much so I'm not going to be like out here saying, like, we are the most humble of entrepreneurs around. But I mean, over time, be open to learning from these crafts people, these traditional, even farmers. I mean, like if you're in the agriculture, nutrition area, health and well-being, speak to farmers. Like in rural areas, they have like mad amount of knowledge. Some of these farmers can just tell you how the weather's going to change maybe in a couple of days or next week by just looking at how the ants are moving. And these are stories. These are things that we can kind of really bring together, make into value that's for the tourism sector, nutrition, agriculture,
but also to preserve and not lose for our identity and culture.
So I'd say there's crazy amount of potential, things to be done. I think we don't have enough people doing enough of it. And obviously there'll be challenges. It takes time. You got to be in there for the long haul. I think the creative space in Sri Lanka can become the backbone of the economy one day. And I mean, if you're in the creative space, you can rest easy knowing that AI isn't going to take your job. That's what I will say.
This is true.
Yeah.
Until they start making robots making things, I think we have.
It still won't. It still won't have the.
No
it still
way.
won't. I mean, this is what I say. Like, I remember there's the Nike ad where like they replace all these footballers, this anime thing with like the clones, the perfect clones, and how it gets boring.
No, it's
I mean,
so
there
boring.
is something that's done by hand, has its little problems, impediments, issues, but that's the absolute beauty of it.
Absolutely. Human
It's character,
touch.
character. So, creative industry is a great place to be. If you're in it, amazing, well done, congratulations being in it. If you want to get into it, please do. But be ready. I mean, it's a slug. You got to be ready for it, but stay humble, stay creative, and you never know where that's. I mean, what's the routes we take, where it can take you.
Exactly. That's what we're hoping for.
Exactly. Brilliant.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely. Same.
I learned so much, and I know that through this project, our biggest goal is the exposure that we want for Sri Lanka's sustainable creative sector, for the opportunities that it can create, the collaborations, and really to value and understand all of that we have in the country, and to do more with it. So thank you so much for all your insights.
You're almost welcome. Pleasure.
Great.
Okay.